Well, it's September, and around comes September the 11th, which is always an interesting time for me for many reasons. But for most of us, it's largely associated, of course, with the attack on the Twin Towers. And, since this has taken place, a lot of events have gone past in hindsight. And I don't think we even necessarily kind of stop long enough to consider how past events lead to future events and kind of where we are right now. Because, of course, one of the things that happened 9/11 was things like the Homeland Security Act, not to mention the billions or trillions of dollars that, or not just in America, but in all the Five Eyes countries, that were suddenly opened up so that new war toys could be bought, new surveillance toys could be bought, budgets could be increased, increasing powers could be given to the security intelligence services, which all would later have an impact as we move into things such as, first of all, the COVID environment. And then, of course, now we're moving more and more towards governments around the world that are actually talking about actual war with Russia and China, which, by the way, I think is a fallacy, because at the end of the day, anybody in the Western world trying to take on China at the current moment, considering how many fires we have in the oven, is just dreaming. And again, this is kind of, and we will get back to 9/11, but it's again something that's sort of waking up. I was thinking about this morning, going early on in the piece when Putin decided to invade the Ukraine, and the US decided that they were going to respond and they were going to get behind the Ukraine. The first thought I found myself thinking was like, A, are these guys just stupid? And B, are they nuts? Because the reality was that prior to all these events, I got a very good tutelage from a friend of mine that was very much an expert on Russian military, and I had a very good idea about what Russia's military strength was and what their tactics were going to be like, and why basically the West, fighting the way that they were fighting, were doomed to lose. And also kind of like struck myself going, I had plenty of arguments with people who, have never carried a pack in their life, never carried a rifle, and they were absolutely listening to the Western media, very hardcore left-wing friends who are old enough to have remembered Vietnam, lived through the Iraq War, basically should know better than to actually believe the Western media, because they have continuously lied. I mean, seriously, why do we even... It does my head in. But, they insisted that they knew better, and that, the guy that actually worked in army intelligence and studied all this stuff didn't know anything, and that, the war would be over, as they told us, by Christmas. And it's not. And it's going on, and all that's happening is that basically if they do go to war with Russia, or, is that it's a really weird thing too, because if they go to war with Russia, by Russia itself, they are probably going to win, but they probably won't get their support, because China will turn around and actually make sure things are a bit difficult for them. And that's the whole point, because at the end of the day, you're not having a war with just Russia, you're having a war with China. But this is where it gets interesting, because Russia and China are not allies. And at the end of the day, it's like the whole situation where China just wants to sit back and watch the Russia and the West annihilate each other. And that's why I thought this was all crazy and stupid, because at the end of the day, all you're doing is tying yourself out so that the guy standing there, they can go, yeah, good on you guys, go on, go for it. And that's what we're happening. I mean, the reality is we have more in common with the USSR, or the former USSR, Russia, than we do have in China in terms of values, economics, cultural events. But no, we're going to turn around and we're going to end up fighting these guys who we should be natural allies, and the end result will be basically the collapse and the end of the Western world, which many might argue, because of 200 or 300 years of colonial history, that's probably not a bad thing. Maybe, but I haven't seen anything come out of China which makes me think that their new empire is going to be any more empathetic or have any better respect for human values than the Western society has had. However, we have had things like the Magna Carta and Westminster system, which I, for one, think are actually worth preserving. And unfortunately, again, 9/11 has, largely because of all the laws bypassed, have actually undermined this particular situation and created a situation when things like COVID occurred, it gave people, all those governments, very much the power to kind of overstate and kind of overreach. And again, they brought in more powers, which again, none of the new governments have brought back and have suspended. And so we can go on about Donald Trump's tyranny all we want, but we keep forgetting that in the case of Donald Trump, prior to Donald Trump, like a lot of that money that was going to ISIS was coming from the Biden administration, and it was ramping up. It wasn't going downwards, it was ramping up. So Donald's just escalated what was already happening. And again, we've got this whole dilemma of the neoconservative, neoliberal element, which we turn around, we overthrow the great evil neocons, and we're left with neoliberalism, which really hasn't done a lot for the common man in the street and has basically made their plight even worse. Which again is something we're not really actually discussing. In my mind, we need to discuss a return to things like, we need a Kirkonomics. We need to really examine the government and administrations of not just Kirk, but Allende and the Whitlam government. And effectively, they had a blue pact which basically found a way that, in the Western society, everyone could get a piece of pie and no one got left behind. And it wasn't it's far better than what we've been offered at this point. But let's go back to 9/11, because I did promise you. Now, one of the things that always bugged me about 9/11 was, that we know about the Israelis giving the high fives, and I've looked into that a little bit, and the only thing that really struck me about that announcement was that how the supposed guys that passed themselves off journalists later on always used to use the word missions, and I've never heard a journalist refer to their work as a mission. They always should say it was an assignment, but that's, they all managed to have the short little haircuts and the rest of it, but nothing on the surface that you could really pin down. And of course, then there was also the Adigo messaging service, which was an Israeli company, which did warn a number of people in the building to get the hell out of the building the day before and not go in. And there's even things like the mayor of Chicago, I think Brown, I want to say, he again was warned not to get on an airplane that particular day. So there's plenty of evidence that there was a lot of intel that something was going to go down. But for me, and a lot of the evidence, I said, points in the direction of our friends in Israel. And again, not the Israelis, not the Jews, but the military-industrial complex. These people, this elite within Israel, which is making all of the Israeli people and all the Palestinians suffer. So please don't go around hating on the Jews, because, I've seen protests out there where they're out there in the if not the hundreds of thousands, in the very high tens of thousands, and they're not happy about this either. So let's put the blame firmly where it's designed, on that military-industrial complex where war, technology, oil and energy meets for the singular purpose of increasing the profits of set corporations every year, bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point that it's no longer sustainable and it collapses. But that's another story altogether. The issue really, for me, came down to the issue of the Anthrax. For me, the smoking gun, the thing that people do not talk about enough is that the situation where, in the days after 9/11, it was widely suggested that the Al-Qaeda terrorists linked to Osama bin Laden and the 9/11 attack had also been planning to carry out basically an anthrax attack. And since some of the samples of this was proven that the realtor, who was also instantly connected to a major media source in Florida, she was infected, and she was one of the ones that actually rented the flat to the 9/11 hijackers down in Florida. And then there would be various other senators and people sort of targeted throughout the US from this anthrax, which was slowly building up the strum. It was all connected to 9/11 attackers. And it even came out, and supported by, I think, Rumsfeld, that there had been a report, I think it was first published in Jane's Intelligence, that Mohammed Atta had been filmed meeting a Iraqi colonel in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, to receive a vial of anthrax. Now, what happened next is interesting, because the story was building up to a huge crescendo, and then the Federation of American Scientists, who's probably like the most distinguished academic alumni, probably why their story got so much support when probably wouldn't have otherwise, turned around and did the crazy thing of doing an actual gene sampling on an in-depth forensic examination on the anthrax. And lo and behold, they discovered that they actually knew the source of where the specific anthrax came from, and it wasn't Iraq. In actual fact, it had come from Fort Detrick's, the United States Chemical Weapons Research Facility in Virginia, Maryland, or Washington, D.C., the exact state and county where the very first covert subject, who was also a serving soldier, served overseas, but not in the designation by the local papers, designated him as someone that had served overseas in an American base, so that would immediately ruled out China. I think it's Percy Diego Garcia, but that's another story, as I say again. And that's where the whole story fell apart. And everyone quickly forgot about the story, and it went under, and they walked away from that one. But not before we need to go back to this whole issue about Jane's Intelligence, saying about this and Mohammed Atta meeting this Iraqi colonel. Because when you actually dig into the story a little bit deeper, what you actually find, and bear in mind, this was all taking place before 9/11. These events, okay, very significant too, because there was a surveillance operation going in Czechoslovakia on Mohammed Atta, who at that time supposedly we'd never actually heard of, other though he had a connection to a Hamburg cell, which in turn would be connected to a dead drug enforcement agent, and basically the same guys that got the Lockerbie bombing. So there was two guys in that, Matthew Gannon and another agent from the ISA, Intelligence Service Activity Unit, Military Intelligence Special Branches, basically. And they had been basically kind of tracking down where the original hostages had been, and Lockerbie blew up. And basically the people that were connected to the bombing of that was connected to the same cell in Hamburg, is how I recall it. However, for the purpose of this story, what the important thing that you need to remember is that Czechoslovakia intelligence were told that this guy's Mohammed Atta, and that's where it gets interesting, because the people that told them that, because remember, Mohammed Atta did not have a profile at this stage, was actually Israeli intelligence. Now think about this. This is before the actual event, before anyone knows about Mohammed Atta, before they know he's going to be 9/11. They're saying, this guy here is Mohammed Atta. Now, there's one small problem with that particular problem, which no one has ever wanted to really address, and it's a very important one, because at the time that this operation was taking place, Mohammed Atta was actually on the other side of the world in America. In fact, he was in jail that weekend because he'd been caught speeding without a license. And basically, it's been a weekend before that all got sorted out. And he was released. So, the obvious thing is you can't be in two places at once. But yet, here we had a specific operation run by Israeli intelligence saying, this guy here is Mohammed Atta, he's got anthrax. So my attitude is that actually is a smoking gun that tells us that all of this 9/11 stuff actually was, as they say, an inside job. And, lots of people go, oh, that's terrible. And they're actually, even Samantha Power's husband, Samantha Power is one of the USAID workers that was working on Sri Lanka, telling them, you better start controlling the internet, before John Podesta came over here and was doing the same thing just before the Christchurch call, which saw the shooting loaded vial. But her husband had been specifically working for Homeland Security, and his job was in the business of nudging. And this is by deplatforming people, demilitarizing them, smearing their careers, basically moving people away by making it so that not even a neoliberal academic. Because I remember very clearly in the 90s, it was all the students at university were very much into this 9/11 thing. Now it's like, oh no, that's conspiracy theories. Oh no, that's not cool. We don't touch those anymore. That was all in itself basically orchestrated. That was actually a program to make people go, no, we don't want to be involved in 9/11 because it's not good for our careers. Think about that. They actually went to that level because they were getting so frustrated at what was being shown that people were like showing time World Trade Center 7. Oh yeah, that's really falls straight down. That seems really natural. 5 different sources telling us that it's actually been pulled, like first name, last name on the mainstream media. 15 different FBI agents coming out saying, actually, we told you guys that this was going to go on. I think it was called Able Danger, was the human intelligence operation. It was just becoming increasingly ridiculous that 9/11, that people, grown adults, would believe that 9/11 was as the official narrative painted it. And again, bear in mind that in the Investigate magazine that I wrote in 2000, so this is on record, this is my own first-hand experience, we wrote a series called Pacific Jihad, and in the third paragraph of that story, we talked about basically how it was known that Osama bin Laden was going to use civilian airplanes to carry attacks in the United States of America. I knew this was in October 2000, I published that. That's on the record. So if I, little old me, down the end of the world, only armed with my internet and a few people and a bit of paid attention to what's going on, can figure that out, you tell me the American intelligence, with all its mighty millions of dollars, billions in fact, couldn't work this out? Well, apparently so. And of course, where we're now at the current situation with 9/11, of course, is that there is also increasing information that links, that a lot of those connections had Saudi connections. And again, that shouldn't really surprise us, because when we look at things like the Bank of Commerce, BCCI International, you had a very strong case here of America, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And I'm talking about a intelligence community that had walked off the reservation. They were not doing things by the books. They were not doing things that were allowed. They were working in their own vested interest for their own people, aka the military-industrial complex. But effectively, there's a lot of evidence that the Saudi Arabian government actually knew what was going on, and they'd actually, had a hand in this. And again, every once in a while when Saudi Arabia starts to misbehave, we see American governments turn around and say, well, I think we might go back and visit that 9/11 file. I'm saying to you, we don't really need to. In terms of the core proving beyond proof, beyond doubt, that something stinks, the Mohammed Atta anthrax attacks is without doubt the smoking gun, that the whole 9/11 narrative sucks dog balls. It doesn't suck, it blows. And I didn't even think that was physically possible. So, okay, that's my little 9/11 story that I just thought, every September 11th, I like to do a story to remind people about this event and remind them that there is a military-industrial complex out there, as JFK warned us. In fact, many, many people have warned us. Allende, Whitlam, Kirk, all of which are no longer with us, have told us that these guys are not to be trusted. They're not good people. And it's about time we kind of woke up and realised that situation, instead of also going looking at this whole directive between left and right, because it doesn't apply. When you look at all these sort of like blackmail stories about Epstein and so on, do you think pardon me, do you think this clique of, and I don't like to say, I won't even call it Mossad, because I said it's very important to understand this is a private enterprise operation. It may have direct tendrils connections to those intelligence agencies, but it is not operating with any sanction. But the reality is these guys are not good people, and do you think that they're going to turn around and only bribe the Democrats and only going to bribe the Republicans, or blackmail and whatever's need, silver bullet, lead bullet, one or the other? Of course they're not. They're going to work both sides of the street. And it's about time we started realising this, and we started focusing our attention not on left and right, but basically at the up, and follow the money where it always goes, because the money is the thing that doesn't lie. And even in the Epstein situation, we're focusing on the human trafficking, and a lot of the focus is on Epstein Island, but we don't look at things like the ranch in Zorro, which look like a much more industrial scale, and go, what's going on here? Because this wasn't just about money laundering. This was about kooky science as well. But we'll save that video for another day. The main thing today is to actually turn around and look at the fact that the Mohammed Atta anthrax attack in Prague, as the Czechoslovakians were tipped off by Israeli intelligence well before 9/11, while Mohammed Atta was in jail that weekend, it is a big, smoky turd that we probably need to be talking about a lot more. Have a great day, everybody, and, also make sure you get out there and have a bit of fun and enjoy the people you're with, because, some things are actually, at the end of the day, more important than getting yourself tied up in knots about things, largely to be aware, but not to be obsessed.